there's nothing that really compares to it even at an international level. So, nearly only a quarter of women were literate in 1980, and by 2015, about 70% are literate, and you see a similar increase for men too. So, in that sense, our labor force has also become more educated, more skilled, and also in that sense, potentially in a better position to secure better and good jobs for themselves in the marketplace. So this is another sort of positive advancement that we've witnessed over the last 30 years. Now, coming back to the question of women's work, and this I think is something that is fairly familiar. It's a debate that occupies a lot of national interest, which has been that women's work has steadily declined. So the number of women who are of working age and who participate in the economy has steadily declined. So in this case here, in 1990, about half of rural women were participating in the economy, and this had fallen to 28. In the case of urban women, this was always fairly small, and this has also steadily declined and sort of had remained at 22%. For men, on the other hand, we don't see such a strong decline. It always sort of stays around 80%. Now, why is this happening? And this has been stated as sort of a cause for worry. But I will submit that the steady decline that we see for female workforce is not something that is entirely worrying. In fact, if you look at the nature of this decline and who these women are who have withdrawn from work over the last 30 years, it really suggests a positive trend. I will so then say that the levels for low female labor force participation is a cause for worry, but the decline is not necessarily a bad thing. And why do I say this? So if you look at this table, what I have here is I've divided our sample or the employment labor force into quintiles based on their household income. So the first quintile is the poorest household, the second, the next poorest, and the 10th is essentially the richest households. Now, when you'll see the first quintile, the average real per capita expenditure in 1999-2000 was about 216 rupees per month per head. For the richest, it was nearly 1,256. Right now, when you look at in the beginning of 2000, what you have here is in the poorest households, 45% of women participated in the economy in paid work, which is to say that if you are from a poor household, then nearly half of those women, if you take a sample of poor households, then nearly half of those women in those sample will be participating. Whereas if you take women from the richer households, they are not participating. Now, in the last 10 years, if you look at the decline, if you look at the change in the labor force participation rate, what you see here is that women's labor force participation rate has in fact declined amongst the poorest households. So from 45%, now only 28% of women in the poorest households are participating in paid work, 26%, so it's a fall from 41 to 26. In the case of the richer households, we don't really see much change. So which is to say that this huge decline that you see over these years is really led by women who are in poor households who are withdrawing from work. And now, if you consider that most of these women were primarily engaged in unpaid family work, in manual, drudgerous work in agriculture, the decline and the ability to withdraw from labor force is essentially a good thing. So in terms of a real welfare perspective, the fact that women are not working anymore suggests that this is led by the fact that their household incomes have increased and they are not forced to participate in the labor market. So I would submit that the increase in while the decline in labor force participation rate amongst women is not a huge matter of concern. And so it is not something that is necessarily a bad thing. However, it remains to be said that the low labor force participation rates overall is something that we need to address and something that needs to be investigated closely. So this is another aspect that we witness over the last 30 years, that women have steadily withdrawn. Most of these women have withdrawn because their household incomes have likely increased and they are from poorer households and withdrawn. I'm sorry, is there a question?
No, ma'am. Please go on.
Oh, okay, sorry. Let me just... Right. So now moving on, I'm going to now look at the present, right? So, and what I'm going to do is now, given all of these sort of trends and phenomena that we observe over the last 30 years, and I've just, again, this is not exhaustive in any way. I use the pandemic as a lens to really investigate and do a deep dive into what all these phenomenon really means and how the pandemic has really exposed some of the structural falls in the way our employment or labor force has changed over the last 30 years. So to begin with, I identify these sort of four fault lines. Okay. So first, jobs created have largely been informal or precarious. So even though I showed that like regular salaried work has steadily increased, I will show you that this, even within salaried work, that job as a salaried job, it is still remains extremely informal. Then pre-existing identity-based discrimination has continued. So a lot of labor market outcomes are still dictated by your gender, your caste, and your religion. Jobless growth and high youth unemployment rates are a huge cause of worry, and weak social protection mechanisms and social infrastructure continue even at this time. So let me take each of these apart and show you what is really how these manifests. Right. So, what we see as a result of the lockdown and the pandemic was a massive transformation of workers into informal work. So, this is essentially a transition graph. So, what you have here are the daily wage workers in 2019, self employed in 2019, temporary salaried, and permanent salaried. So, these are permanent salaried are sort of your good, most secure jobs, and your daily wage is the most precarious and informal kind of work, right? And this is essentially showing what was this movement of these workers into other kinds of work, or if they stayed in the same work. So it's the same kind of labor market arrangements in 2020. So this is the end of the year in 2019, and this is the end of the year in 2020. So this data is from the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy's Consumer Pyramid Household Surveys. And this also draws from our report, the State of Working India report of 2021. And what you see here is that there is a massive movement of these. So, on the one hand, you have daily wage workers who are moving into self employment. You also have almost half of permanent salaried workers also moving into self employment, and about 10% moving into daily wage work as well as temporary salaried work. So, and overall, the structure of the economy became more informal. So, what the pandemic exposed is that even the so-called permanent salaried work is not permanent and secure in that sense, and for many people they couldn't hold on to that work in the face of such a massive economic shock. And interesting, and what I've not shown here is that the kind of permanent salaried workers who are more likely to lose their jobs or have to go into self-employment are essentially the poorer ones. If you're a rich, highly paid permanent salaried workers, you're able to retain your job. It's always the workers at the lower end of the income spectrum who are more vulnerable to job loss. So what this exposes is the growth of informal work in the formal sector. So even most regular salaried workers do not have basic entitlements. So you have large companies, include companies like maybe Wipro or Accenture, or even your colleges, universities, who are hiring workers and paying them monthly salaries, but for them too, they do not have basic entitlements like contracts, they may not have paid leave, gratuity, and so on. And in some cases, there's even the lack of an identifiable employer. The whole idea that, Swiggy, Zomato, Uber may also even say, well, they are not workers. They are all self-employed. They are in the gig economy and part-time kind of freelancing with us. So the whole notion of an employer is also very ambiguous now. The interesting thing that you saw is that if you look at the construction sector, you see a lot of these construction workers who don't really have an employer as such. They all negotiate their terms of engagement through a contractor or some third party. And during the lockdown, one interesting thing that you saw is that, at least like in Karnataka at some point, the state government was trying to organize trains for these construction workers or typically migrant workers to return to their states. And suddenly, the huge real estate industry, a lot of these real estate industry representatives suddenly got together to say that no, we can't, we don't want to let go of these workers. They have to stay. So suddenly, when it comes to actually trying to make sure that these workers stay, you have these employers suddenly identifying themselves as employers. But when it comes to making sure that they have housing or their basic social security entitlements are being paid out, you don't have an identifiable employer. So the kinds of employment arrangements have become so complex and being navigated through so many kinds of third-party agreements that it's almost impossible really to sometimes actually ensure that workers are given basic entitlements, let alone basic pay. So this was the graph I showed you earlier, which was the labor productivity increased, right? So I showed you that there was a steady increase in labor productivity over the years in organized manufacturing. But what this hides really, what this belies is what is this, how did this labor productivity increase manifest for the workers? So the red line here is what is the manager's compensation. And as you can see here, manager's compensation is also increased, but of course, at a lower rate than labor productivity. And what about workers? So these are the factory floor workers. What was the change in the production workers' wage rate? Almost zero, right? So alongside the massive labor productivity growth, there has not been an accompanying increase in the workers' wage rates, although there has been some increase in managers' compensation, but then this points towards an increasing levels of heterogeneity and inequality within wage rates and, sort of worsening that situation in that sense. So the labor productivity growth that we saw earlier has not really trickled down to the workers as such. The other aspect that the pandemic exposed is that you have social identities dictating employment outcomes. So, on the one hand, we saw that, and this is again quite famous now, or it's become sort of something that you kind of say automatically. During the pandemic, women were more likely to lose jobs, and then they were also found that even if you were a woman who lost job, your likelihood of coming back to work was very much lower compared to men. And also, what we find is that marginalized communities like scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and Muslims faced much higher precarity. So, what is it in the case of women? What we find in our study is that if a woman was lost jobs, I mean, women were on the one hand 7 times more likely than men to lose employment, and having lost employment, they were 11 times more likely to not return. So women had fewer fallback options, both in terms of employment and industry. So with men, when a man loses his job, he then he's able to navigate into either construction work or some kind of farm employment, some kind of street vending. There's always these fallbacks that men have access to, whereas for women that is not really an option. Women are just pushed out of the labor force entirely. What we also see is that there was a huge unequal distribution of work within the household. This has been work demonstrated by Ashwini Deshpande and all, talking about how women's work hugely increased during the lockdown and in the months subsequently. But this really also highlights what is the pre-existing disparities that has been there for women even before the pandemic. As you can see in this little comic, this is basically the rat race or the corporate race for a man compared to a woman. So for men, it's clear roads ahead. Women have to navigate laundry, ironing, washing dishes, all of these. Also wearing high heels and work appropriate, rather uncomfortable wear to get to the other end of the road. So there has been a double, maybe even triple burden that women have had to navigate. There is a huge inequality in the distribution of work within households, and even when women are at work, the kinds of work that they do, even when it's comparable to what men do, even when women's qualifications are compared to what a man's is, she's often always paid much less than the corresponding man. So this has been all the more exposed during these last year. What did we see in the case of marginalized communities? So what we find is that amongst the marginalized communities like scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, they lost work. They were far more vulnerable to losing work, but then they were also able to come back to work quickly because of the nature of work that they're engaged in. So, because daily wage work is something that there's an ease of exit, but there's also an ease of entry, these workers were able to come back. But then they had to, when they came back, their incomes fell drastically, much more than their dominant or the richer counterparts. We also see that there are certain communities, especially like Muslims, who do not have fallback options like land. So agriculture and farming was a very important cushion for workers in the rural areas. So even during the lockdown, they were able to at least work their land, if not for own subsistence, but also for marketing, selling it in the market. When communities are deprived of access to land, and of course this has an historical aspect to it, they obviously don't have these fallback options, meaning that they even then bore the brunt of the lockdown and the month subsequently. So the impact was also very unequal in terms of the social identity. And this again, it highlights pre-existing disparities. So in this graph, I want to spend a little time here. Basically, what this graph is, every at the bottom you have different occupation types. So you have elementary occupations, you have agriculture and fisheries, craft and trade, plant machine operating, personal services, and senior officers, clerks, and professionals, and associates professionals. So each, if you notice, this is always slightly better or slightly more well-paid occupations. So the numbers here is the average earnings in each of these occupations. So for example, a professional will typically earn around 20,000, whereas an elementary occupation, I mean a daily wage worker, earns around one fifth of that, around 4,000. Now each bar here is what we call a representation index. So what you have here, actually this bar here is for SCs, this is for STs, this is OBCs, and this is other. Some of the legend is missing, and my apologies for that. So what a representation index says is that how it's calculated is that suppose scheduled castes are 10% of the workforce. But although they are 10% of the workforce, suppose they are 20% of the elementary occupation workforce. So, which is to say, even though scheduled castes are just 10% of the workforce, their presence in elementary occupations is double that, which is so then a representation index is essentially 2. So, a large representation index of the taller bar means that they are overrepresented in a particular activity. And so it's very evident here that the moment something is a low paid occupation, you have a overrepresentation of these marginalized communities. And as you go up higher into higher paid occupations, then the kind of communities that are overrepresented here are the privileged communities, right? So amongst professionals, the general category is nearly double than their share in the workforce in general. So this means that social identities continue to play a crucial role in who does what in the economy. So this is something that liberalization has not achieved. It was never set out to achieve it, but these are some of the sort of inequities that have not been addressed over the last year. Another aspect that the pandemic showed us was that young workers were particularly likely to lose employment. So, if you have some experience, if you have some networks in the labor market, you're less likely to lose jobs. And not just that, you're also likely to come back to work if you have more experience. And now we've gone through 2 years of essentially a lockdown. We have two cohorts graduating into very high labor market uncertainty. So in that sense, we are really set for very difficult times for the youth in the workforce who are just going to join the workforce. Um, and this comes at the back of very high unemployment rates pre-pandemics. So again, what we see here is the unemployment rate by education level. The yellow bar is basically the youth of 15 to 30, and this is for in 2011-12. Then this is the same age group a yearly in 2017-18, and the next age group in 2018-19. The blue is just the older workforce or the older workforce. Yeah. So as you can see here, youth unemployment rate is the highest for the higher educated. So if you're a graduate, you're more likely to be unemployed compared to an illiterate person. And now this is pre-pandemic. Now add to it that you're going to have 2 years of graduates who passed out into a hugely tightly, low absorption labor economy. So this is going to get further higher. Right? So about 35% was the youth unemployment rate pre-pandemic. This has already increased, I think, to about 50% according to CMI. So what does this now mean for the future? I mean, so this has all been rather bleak news in terms of what is the progress we've made and how we've been, in a sense, set back by the pandemic, but also the fact that the pandemic didn't really set us back. It also sort of exposed the ways in which some of the labor market developments have not been exactly favorable. So what does the future hold? And here I'm going to keep this deep, but I'm happy to discuss each of these. So there are several imperatives that we need for a employment-led growth. To begin with, as you can see, all of my presentation, all of the arguments I've made relied so much on data. And as a country, India its national statistics has occupied pride of place nationally as well as internationally. And it is important that we continue this legacy that we have, that our data should not be compromised by political interests or any other interests. And so it is commendable that things like the periodic labor force survey has become a yearly endeavor. So every year we're able to get high frequency indicators of employment. But it should also be the case that if that none of these are compromised because the data doesn't tell us what we want to hear. In that sense, the consumption surveys should also be revived so that we have data. It's also good that the government has also launched several other smaller surveys, like the migrant survey, construction worker survey, the formal workforce survey, to get more information. And as a follow-up, the data then gives us both the infrastructure as well as the knowledge to ensure that social security provisions reach all. So the migrant crisis that we saw was exacerbated because we had absolutely no information. We also had no ways of reaching these people. So data is crucial to ensure that social security provisions reach all. The recent amendments in Social Security Act is beneficial in that sense, but there's still a long way to go in terms of developing the infrastructure as well as implementing it. We also call for an employment guarantee. I mean, the NREGA is actually a huge achievement that our country has had. It's been able to provide a buffer employment for many people across the country, across many states. Particularly in the pandemic, it's become a very important fallback employment. So we also argue for this to be sort of extended to the urban regions. Of course, both the NREGA as well as the urban employment guarantee should not be seen as the end to the sort of employment growth. It should be there as a buffer to sort of suck up surplus labor and then also then prop up infrastructure as well. Another crucial aspect that we need to address for employment growth is women's employment. One is the concept of just acknowledging and measuring women's work adequately, because when you say that women's employment or women, only 20% of women are working, it does a huge disservice to the, I think, 90 to 100% of women who are actually working but whose work is not captured by our statistics. But besides that, not just of capturing, but also ensuring that women have access to good jobs and which are paid in a remunerative way. This is also an important aspect for policy. We also argue for something called the universal basic services. I mean, which is basically public-led investment in basic services like health, in particular health and education. So, and we feel that this is especially imperative given what this crisis has led us into. So, what we are going to see now is massive educational deficits. So, I mean, there's been enough reports, and I think recently a new report has also been launched talking about how children, especially from poorer households, are being set back in terms of their learning abilities. So there's going to be huge educational deficits that the country is going to be confronted with. So that is why it is imperative that the government invests in our schools and in our public schools to sort of meet the educational deficit. And it also is imperative to invest in our health services because I think, especially given the massive scale of the vaccination program and what the pandemic has highlighted, which is the need to have basic health infrastructure in place, this is also an important investment that the government needs to make. But where does this, what is the context of this in the place of employment? These are also services that can, in a sense, generate good jobs, right? So both health and education can generate several jobs. I think just filling up vacancies can generate up to 15 million, about 1.5 million jobs is what we've estimated. So there's huge employment generation potential in health and education. And not just that, the employment generation is of the nature that it can cater to both the youth and to the women who have been displaced because of the pandemic. And it can also then meet a lot of the deficits that the pandemic and the nature of the pandemic has created. And so the broader medium term argument need of the hour is a national employment policy, which I believe is in the works, which would ideally address the huge quantitative and qualitative problems we have both at the labor demand side as well as the labor supply side, and bring together a cohesive framework to really propel employment growth both in terms of the number of jobs as well as in terms of good jobs in the economy. So with that, I'm going to conclude. Happy to take questions and discuss any of these. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was an interesting and innovative presentation, full of information, especially the double burden of women. It was an interesting representation of it. I would request the participants, the offline as well as the online participants, to come forward with your questions. Online participants can post their questions in the chat box or they can ask, and the session is open for questions.
Hello, ma'am.
Yeah, so Dr. Rosa, excellent presentation. Just wanted to ask you one question. What is your opinion about the unemployment rate? I think, do you think it's still underestimated, or still it just because it just cover the formal sector? What's your opinion on that?
Thank you, Kedar. Okay, so on the unemployment rate, okay, here's my take on unemployment. I think there's some literature on this, but I think in the context of a developing country like India, I would argue that a measure like unemployment rate is really an inadequate measure of the health of our labor market. And why do I say this? If you see, our unemployment rate has historically been about 3%, 4%, 5%. Then recently it increased. But then are we then saying that because of the low unemployment rate, does it indicate that our labor market is of good health? No. The fact is that for most households in our country, unemployment is a luxury. So to stay out of the workforce and to actually have the luxury of looking for a job and actively looking for that while not actually working is not something that most households can afford to do. So in that sense, I would say that sort of measuring the performance of the economy in terms of unemployment rate is a partial view of the economy. In terms of the trends, there is some there is something to be said that during the pandemic you have a huge unemployment rate, and this is really because of the stoppage of the economy, of economic activity. So people are forced to not work at all and actively seek work. But then once mobility restrictions were removed and most of these restrictions were removed, unemployment rate fell. But then is that to say that our labor market is now healthy again? No, right? It means that people are forced to come back into work. So my point is that the overall, I mean, in terms of the employment statistics and does it measure informal sector, how the PLFS and employment unemployment surveys are carried out is in a way that it does capture informal work, right? I mean, things like the EPFO data, for instance, does not. But the PLFS does capture the informal sector to a large extent. So in terms of completeness, I think the statistics are complete. But in terms of whether this statistic of an unemployment rate is a valid measure of the health of the economy, I would say that it is a very partial measure. And in fact, things like the rate of self-employment or movement into agriculture, this is really what is telling us about the health of the economy. And post-pandemic, you'll see that after many years, now the share of agriculture has actually increased. Workers are moving into agriculture. More workers are in self-employment. More workers are in informal work. These are things that are cause for worry, far, far more than just unemployment rate.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes, thank you.
Yeah, she's able to hear now. Yeah, she's able to hear. Yeah.
But I cannot hear her because she is muted now.
No, I can hear you. So you can ask the question and then I'll unmute. Otherwise, I'll
Madam, I was asking that we always discuss the darker side of the pandemic. That means we always say that there was unemployment and especially in the informal sector. But there is some silver lining also because some could create this challenge into opportunities because they shifted their jobs. For example, they started selling vegetables or fruits, then they started selling masks or they converted themselves into ward boys. Now I am talking only about the informal sector. The income always there is low in the informal sector, but when they change their jobs, they could earn more income than previous. So have you observed such type of examples when you were studying the workers in the pandemic?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting point, but I think I'll disagree to some extent on the silver lining aspect of it. Of course, some people were able to, they moved to some other kind of occupation. But this is this idea of jugaad in India, right? This idea that Indians are so enterprising and they'll find a way. But then it also is driven by desperation. The fact that, I mean, a simple number that I can tell you is that of all the women, of all the people who were teachers pre-pandemic, and this includes university teachers, private school teachers, public teachers, half of them are now out of work. Okay, half of teachers are no longer teachers. They don't even have a job anymore. The other half are now the other about 30% are now in some kind of self-employment of daily wage work, of street vending. Now, is it something commendable that somebody who has the qualification of a teacher is having to do this kind of work? Right? So, of course, in many cases, there is a push, there is the sort of, I hate the word, but the notion of a creative destruction that, you're forced to do something, forced to sort of widen your horizons and do something. And maybe it has a good outcome. Maybe you actually end up earning more than you did. But if you put it in the context of the desperation that drove people into these things, I would hesitate to call it a silver lining, really. The silver lining hopefully may come from greater public investment in our health and education resources, in identifying that there are deficits. We need to bring our teachers back. Our teachers shouldn't be selling vegetables. We need our teachers back in schools. That should be the silver lining. The silver lining is recognizing how important primary health centers are, how important public schools, face-to-face schooling is, right? So I would say that for me would be a silver lining, if at all, from this whole pandemic.
Thank you, ma'am. Any
Ma'am,
other questions?
yes, ma'am, I have a question. Ma'am, recently we have been seeing a lot of changes in the labor laws, like to attract foreign investments. We have been doing a lot of labor changes in the labor laws, and some of them are following the Bangladesh model. Like Uttar Pradesh is following the Bangladesh model. Somehow they are influenced by it. So, what is your take on that, ma'am?
Yeah, you got me. You asked. This is an area that I'm really not very well versed with. So I'm going to make very broad comments here, but I'm sure there are people who are much better placed to speak about this. My broad comment is: see, when the moment labor laws become the sort of bargaining chip, what we are going to witness and what we are already witnessing is a race to the bottom, right? So states are going to sort of try and go as low as you can and as sort of unregulated as possible in the interests of attracting investment. So I think that's a dangerous trajectory. But I also feel the sort of centralization and rationalization that has happened with labor laws is welcome. I think that is long overdue. But I think there should be sort of a threshold that the center needs to establish so that this race to the bottom is not happening. So, I mean, there was this whole understanding initially that labor laws are the states with the more restrictive labor laws are also ones which have witnessed lower growth and lower investments. I think this is the huge Besley-Burgess measure and how it has these findings. But then there have been many works after that which have shown that, well, actually, it's not the case that labor laws didn't have anything to do with that. So I think first we need to really establish that is the race to the bottom really also and in the interest of investment and long-term labor productivity, and maybe it is not. And then there are other ways in which investment and external resources can be attracted. That's my broad take on it. I'm really not an expert, but I think that at the end of the day, the state's role is to protect workers. I mean, the center's role is to protect the workers' interests. And we need to establish the minimum threshold. So things like, I mean, and the analogous argument is Narega has established a minimum threshold in terms of what is the minimum wages rural areas can pay. We need to have the similar thresholds when it comes to the labor laws, and I think it is something that the center needs to sort of lay down.
Ma'am, I have a question.
Yeah.
Ma'am, while small-scale businesses are on decline, how is it that stock market and GDP is on the rise? And what does it mean for free market economies?
Yeah. So my statistics professor in college in Delhi, he used to say this story about somebody having found that the stock market index was highly correlated over time, was highly correlated with the lengths of women's skirts. So the ankle length of how long a woman's skirt was. My point being that I think that the stock market is it's a completely different entity. It does not really, in a sense, measure the health or performance of an economy in many aspects, right? Even during the pandemic, we had a huge stock market increase, right? And but that does not really mean anything about how businesses, especially small businesses, are faring. Having said that, what it indicates is that the kind of growth that has happened is a case where you have small businesses struggling and you have very large business, not even large, but very large businesses reaping huge profits. So profits have really increased at the upper end of the size spectrum of firms. Which is to say that what we are witnessing is a highly unequal trend, the K-shaped recovery, as people are calling it, right? So, I think that on the one hand, the stock market is unrelated to what is happening in sort of our informal economy, and so we can't use that as a gauge. But then it is a gauge of the broader trend towards inequality that we are seeing.